Most people fear coming home to an empty house. I came home early, and I wished to God it had been empty. Instead, the silence was heavy, like the air right before a massive tornado hits the plains. The lights were all off, but the mudroom was cluttered with shoes that absolutely should not have been there. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped over a pair of expensive leather loafers that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I had intended to surprise my husband with a weekend getaway, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the air felt thick and metallic. There was no sound of the television, no clinking of dishes, just a void that seemed to swallow my footsteps. I stood there for a long moment, clutching my keys so hard the metal bit into my palm. I wasn't sure if I should call out or turn around and run back to my car. Something deep in my gut, that primal instinct we all try to ignore, was screaming that the man I loved was in terrible danger. The house looked the same, but the energy had shifted into something cold, dark, and predatory. My name is Julianne, and I am 34 years old. I work as a landscape architect, a job that requires me to notice when the smallest leaf is out of place or when a stone has shifted in a garden path. My husband, Tien, is the center of my world, but lately our world had been shrinking. Tien has been battling a chronic heart condition that left him weak and often confined to our bedroom. He was supposed to be at his physical therapy appointment 3 towns over, a grueling 2-hour session that usually left him exhausted. I had even helped him pack his bag that morning. Yet as I stood in our kitchen, I saw his car keys sitting right there on the granite counter next to a half-empty glass of water. Beside the keys was a box from a high-end, wood-fired pizzeria. Tien is on a strictly regulated, low-sodium diet. Even a single slice of that pizza could send his blood pressure skyrocketing into a danger zone. Seeing that box felt like seeing a weapon left out on the table. My husband wouldn't risk his life for a snack, which meant someone else was in this house, feeding him poison. I didn't hear any laughter, and I didn't hear the sounds of a struggle. What I heard was a whisper. A woman's voice, low, clinical, and chillingly calm. She said, "Just another half dose, Thorn. It needs to look like a natural relapse, not a sudden spike." My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I crept toward the stairs, my socks muffling my movement on the hardwood. Each step felt like a mile. When I reached the landing, I saw that our bedroom door was cracked open just an inch. A sliver of light spilled out into the hallway, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I pressed my face toward the gap, my eyes straining to make sense of the scene inside. I expected to see an affair, a betrayal of the heart, but what I saw was a betrayal of humanity. My husband was lying in our bed, but he looked like a ghost of himself. He was gray-faced, his skin glistening with a sickly sweat, and he was gasping for air in shallow, ragged bursts that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. Tien wasn't just sick. He was being harvested. Standing over him was his sister, Clarice, and a tall man in a dark suit I had never seen before. Clarice was holding Tien's hand, but she wasn't squeezing it for comfort, she was pinning it down to the mattress. The man, whom she had called Thorn, was holding a specialized IV bag filled with a clear, yellowish fluid. They weren't trying to kill him quickly with a pillow or a gun. They were doing it in slow, agonizing installments, making sure his heart failed at a pace that wouldn't alert a coroner. It was a tableau of pure, calculated evil. I watched as Thorn adjusted the drip rate, his expression as blank as a stone. Clarice leaned down and whispered something in Tien's ear, and even from the hallway, I could see the terror in my husband's bulging eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice was a broken wheeze. I realized in that heartbeat that if I walked in and confronted them then, I would likely be the next one on that bed. They were playing for keeps, and I was the only witness. I didn't scream. If I had let out even a whimper, I knew I wouldn't make it out of that hallway alive. My brain shifted into a gear I didn't know I had, the survival gear of a hunted animal. I backed away from the door, inch by agonizing inch, keeping my eyes fixed on the sliver of light until I reached the stairs. I descended with the grace of a shadow, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure they could hear it through the floorboards. Once I reached the mudroom, I stepped outside and waited 30 seconds, gulping in the cold, honest air. Then I slammed the front door as hard as I could. I made sure my heels clicked loudly on the floor as I shouted, "Klein! Honey, the meeting ended early. I'm home." The reaction from upstairs was instantaneous. I heard the frantic scuffling of feet and the muffled thud of a chair being knocked over. It was the distinct, frantic sound of rats fleeing the moment a bright light is switched on in a dark basement. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, forcing a bright, fake smile onto my face, waiting for the monsters to appear. When I finally walked into the bedroom, Clarice was leaning over Klein, looking the picture of a worried, devoted sister. She was dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth, her hands trembling slightly. "Julianne, oh thank God you're here," she gasped, her voice dripping with artificial relief. "Klein had a terrible spell right after you left. He couldn't even make it to his appointment. I called my dear friend, Dr. Thorne, to come over because the ambulance service said there was a massive delay due to a pileup on the highway." Thorne stepped forward, offering a tight, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like a man who spent his life delivering bad news with a hidden agenda. "He's stable for now, Mrs. Wath, Maine," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cold. "But his heart is very fragile. He needs absolute quiet and very specific medication." I looked at Klein, whose eyes were darting toward me, pleading for help he couldn't vocalize. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the overwhelmed, grieving wife. My skin crawled as Thorne's hand brushed against mine while he handed me a fake prescription slip. For the next week, I became the perfect actress in the most dangerous play ever staged. I stayed in the kitchen making kale smoothies and low-sodium soups, acting like I believed every word Clarice said. But I was observing everything with the eyes of a hawk. I noticed what I began to call the bathroom test. Every single time I stood up to go to the bathroom or head to the laundry room, Clarice would magically appear in the hallway. She was always there, leaning against the wall or pretending to dust a picture frame, effectively guarding the bedroom door. They weren't just watching Klein, they were gating him, making sure I never had a single private moment with my own husband. They wanted to ensure I didn't see the IV bags or the way Thorne would slip in through the back entrance at odd hours of the night. It was a domestic prison, and Clarice was the warden. I realized they were waiting for a specific window of time, perhaps a holiday or a weekend when the local doctor was away, to finish what they had started and claim his life. I am the one who handles all our household finances and taxes. Klein always hated numbers, so he left the digital keys to our kingdom in my hands. At 3 a.m. on the fourth night, while Clarice was snoring in the guest room, I crept into my office and logged into our shared vault. I began digging through folders I hadn't looked at in years. That's when I found it. A life insurance policy I didn't recognize from a company we'd never used. It wasn't a new policy, which would have been suspicious. It was an old secondary policy that had been quietly amended 6 months ago. The primary beneficiary had been changed from Julianne, Maine, to a family trust managed entirely by Clarice. The payout was staggering, over $2 million. My blood turned to ice as I realized my husband's life had been appraised and sold. Clarice wasn't just trying to help her brother, she was cashing him in like an old bond. She had set up a legal labyrinth that would leave me with nothing but a funeral bill while she walked away with a fortune. I knew I needed physical proof that would hold up in a court of law. One afternoon, while Clarice was busy on a long consultation call with Thorne in the garden, I slipped into the kitchen. I took a small, sterile dropper and extracted a sample of the special heart tonic Thorne had left on the counter for Klein. I didn't go to a hospital, I knew Thorne had connections there. Instead, I drove to a private environmental lab 2 towns over. I told them I was a landscape architect and I needed a soil and water toxicity test for a sensitive client who was worried about runoff. I asked them to check for specific chemical markers, including concentrated alkaloids. 2 days later, the results came back to my private email. It wasn't poison in the traditional sense, like arsenic or cyanide. It was digitalis, a common heart medication, but it was at a concentration 3 times the maximum legal dose. It was genius and ghoulish. They weren't using an illegal substance. They were using his own medicine to create a natural heart failure that any regular autopsy would miss. I needed to see what happened when I wasn't in the room. I went to a local electronics store and bought a generic-looking Wi-Fi extender that actually housed a high-definition night vision camera. I installed it in the master bedroom, disguised behind a stack of books on the nightstand. That night, I sat on the living room sofa staring at my phone screen with my headphones on. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to break my heart. I watched Clarice and Thorne standing by the bed, laughing softly as they adjusted the drip on the IV. Thorne was mocking the way I looked when I cried, and Clarice was nodding, her face twisted in a look of pure contempt. Then, I saw the most heartbreaking thing of all. Klein reached out a trembling hand, trying to grab his phone from the nightstand, likely to text me for help. Clarice didn't just stop him. She slapped his hand away with a sharp, stinging sound and hissed, "Don't be a difficult patient, Klein. It's almost over." I had to bite my lip until it bled to keep from screaming and running upstairs to kill her. The next morning, Clarice cornered me in the kitchen. She looked at me with those fake, watery eyes, her voice dripping with a syrup-sweet tone that made my stomach turn. "Julianne, darling, you look absolutely exhausted," she said, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. "The stress of caring for Klein is clearly taking a toll on your health. Why don't you take this weekend and head to that luxury spa in the city? Dr. Thorne and I have everything handled here. We'll keep him stable, and you can come back refreshed on Monday." I knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted me out of the house for the final event. They needed a window where I wasn't there to call for a second opinion or notice the exact time of death. If I were at a spa, I would have a perfect alibi, and they would have a perfect crime scene. I looked her right in the eyes and forced a weary, grateful smile. "You're right, Clarice. I'm at my breaking point. I'll pack a bag and head out this afternoon." I realized then that simply calling the police wouldn't be enough to stop them. Thorne was a licensed medical doctor with a clean record, and Clarice was seen as a pillar of the community. If I called 911 and claimed they were poisoning him, they would simply dispose of the evidence before the sirens reached the driveway. Thorne would claim I was hysterical due to the stress of my husband's illness, and given his professional standing, the police would likely believe him. I needed to be surgical. I needed to let them think they were winning, so they would become overconfident and sloppy. A trapped animal is dangerous, but an animal that thinks it has already won is vulnerable. I decided I would play the part of the fleeing wife until the very last second. I packed a suitcase with heavy items to make it look full, and made sure Clarice saw me load it into my car. I was beginning the most important landscape project of my life, the total demolition of my husband's enemies. I drove away from the house at 4 p.m., making sure Clarice watched me from the upstairs window. But I didn't go to the spa. I drove 2 miles away to a nondescript motel and checked in under a false name. From my laptop, I began the digital border wall. I had spent the last 48 hours setting up a protected escrow account. Using my power of attorney, I moved every single cent of our liquid assets, the savings, the investments, the emergency funds, into an account that required a physical thumbprint and a 2-factor hardware key that was currently hanging around my neck. If Clarice tried to access the family trust or any of our joint accounts after Klein passed, she would find them bone dry. I also contacted a private life insurance investigator I had found through a colleague. I didn't tell him everything yet. I just told him I had concerns about a fraudulent amendment to a policy. I was laying the groundwork for a legal ambush that would leave them no room to breathe. I sat in that dark motel room, staring at my phone. I had hacked the app for Klein's heart monitor, the one that sent data to his regular cardiologist. I had set a custom alert on my phone to trigger if his heart rate hit a certain threshold. At 2:15 a.m., the phone began to buzz with a violent, rhythmic pulse. The death notification was active. His heart rate was skyrocketing, then dipping dangerously low into bradycardia. They were doing it. Right now. In our house, in our bed, they were finally pushing the final dose. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone, but I took a deep breath and centered myself. I wasn't a victim anymore, I was the hammer. I checked the live feed from the hidden camera. I saw Thorne standing over Klein, his thumb on a syringe, while Clarice held a legal document in front of Klein's face. trying to force his limp hand to hold a pen. They were trying to get one last signature before the light went out. I didn't call the local police. I knew the response time would be too slow. Instead, I called the medical board's emergency investigative unit and the head of the insurance company's fraud division, whom I had alerted earlier. I told them I was witnessing a live attempted murder and insurance fraud in progress. I gave them the link to the live stream from my hidden camera. I am heading there now, I told them, my voice cold and steady. If you want to catch a doctor in the act of killing for profit, you have exactly 10 minutes. I jumped into my car and raced back to the house, the tires screaming against the asphalt. I didn't turn on my headlights as I pulled into the driveway. I wanted the element of surprise. I was no longer the landscape architect. I was the storm that was about to level their entire world. I reached the front door, inserted my key, and turned it slowly. The silence of the night feeling like a heavy shroud. I burst into the bedroom with a force that sent the door slamming against the wall. The scene was exactly as it had been on my phone screen, but the smell was worse, the smell of sweat, ozone, and impending death. Thorn was mid-motion, his thumb pressed against the plunger of a syringe. Clarice was shouting at Klein to just sign the damn paper. They both froze, looking at me like I was a ghost. "Stop," I said. I didn't scream. My voice was a dead, terrifying calm that seemed to fill the room. "Don't move a muscle, Thorn. The house isn't surrounded by police. It's surrounded by the people who sign your paychecks and the people who can take your license away forever." I held up my phone, showing them the recording light. Thorn's face went from pale to a ghostly white. Clarice dropped the pen, her mouth hanging open like a landed fish. They were caught in the most literal sense of the word, trapped by their own greed and my calculated silence. Thorn panicked first. He tried to lung toward the bathroom to flush the syringe, but I stepped in his way, holding a heavy garden spade I'd grabbed from the mudroom. "Try it," I dared him. Clarice scrambled to hide the trust documents under the pillow, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't even grip the paper. But what Thorn didn't realize was the most important part of my plan. Hours before I left for the spa, I had replaced his supply of concentrated digitalis with simple harmless saline. They hadn't been pumping Klein with poison for the last few hours. They'd been pumping him with salt water. They hadn't killed him yet, but they had spent the last 6 hours on camera trying to do it. The evidence of their intent was undeniable. Just as Thorn began to shout a protest, the front door downstairs was kicked open, and the heavy boots of the investigators flooded the hallway. The doctor and the sister were led away in handcuffs, their reign of terror ending in a pathetic whimper. As the investigators led a sobbing Clarice past me, she suddenly stopped. She looked at me with a twisted, hateful grin that sent a new chill down my spine. "You think you're the big hero, Julianne?" She spat, her voice raspy. "You think you've saved your perfect little life? Check the hidden files on your husband's laptop. Check the main estate. Klein didn't just get sick. He spent the last 3 years gambling away every cent of your retirement and your equity. I wasn't trying to steal your money, you idiot. I was trying to get the insurance payout to cover the massive debts he owes to people who are much meaner than me. I was saving the family name from the shame your perfect husband brought on us." My heart, which had just begun to settle, stopped again. Was she lying to hurt me one last time? Or was there a second, deeper betrayal hiding in the shadows of my own home? I looked at Klein, who was now being loaded onto a stretcher by real paramedics. He wouldn't look me in the eye. After the house was cleared and Klein was safely in the cardiac intensive care unit under 24-hour guard, I sat in my office. My hands were trembling as I opened his laptop. I found the folder Clarice had mentioned, hidden behind 3 layers of password protection. It took me 2 hours to break through. When I did, my world collapsed for a second time. She wasn't lying. Klein had a hidden gambling portal. He had been betting on high-stakes international sports for years. He wasn't just a victim of a heart condition. He was a liability. He had been borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Clarice's business to cover his mounting losses. And when she found out, she had given him an ultimatum. He had been complicit in the plan to end his own life so that the insurance money would pay her back and clear his slate. My husband hadn't just been poisoned by his sister, he had been poisoned by his own weakness, and he had been willing to leave me a widow just to settle his scores. I drove to the hospital at dawn. I walked into Klein's room, past the police officer at the door. He looked better. The saline had actually helped hydrate him. But he looked smaller than I remembered. I sat in the chair by his bed and didn't say a word. I just stared at him until he finally looked up. "Did you know?" I asked. The silence stretched for an eternity before he finally whispered, "I thought if I died, the insurance would pay them back and leave you with the rest. I was trying to fix it, Julianne. I didn't want you to find out about the debt." He had consented to his own slow-motion murder. He had sat there, day after day, letting his sister and Thorn kill him because he was too much of a coward to face me and admit he'd lost our future. He thought his death was a financial solution. He didn't realize that if he died with those debts, the creditors would have come for me anyway. He hadn't been trying to save me, he had been trying to escape. I spent the next several hours with a forensic accountant. The news was even worse than I feared. If Klein had died, and I had claimed that insurance money, the company would have flagged the gambling debts as a material change in risk and denied the claim. If the insurance didn't pay, I would have been legally liable for over $400,000 in gambling debt because of joint signatures Klein had forged on our home equity line of credit. I wasn't just losing a husband. I was on the verge of losing my house, my business, and my freedom. Clarice and Thorn had been planning to take the bulk of the money and leave me to fight the creditors. I realized that the cold revenge I had planned wasn't over. It was just entering its most critical phase. I had to find a way to pivot this disaster into a victory, or I would be bankrupt by the end of the month. I needed a lever, and I needed it now. I went back to the hidden camera footage from the bedroom, but this time, I didn't look at the night of the murder. I went back to the very first day I installed it. I spent 18 hours straight scrubbing through every minute of video. That's when I found the golden ticket. Thorn and Clarice were in the room while Klein was asleep. They weren't talking about him. They were discussing a previous case from 2 years ago, a woman named Martha. They were laughing about how easy it had been to convince her family she'd passed from natural causes. They were serial killers. They had done this before for profit. Clarice wasn't just a desperate sister. She was a partner in a murder-for-hire scheme. This wasn't a family rescue or a debt settlement. It was a cold-blooded business model. This information changed everything. I didn't just have evidence of an attempted murder. I had the key to a multi-year conspiracy that would involve the FBI. I didn't go to the police with the new footage immediately. I went to the jail to see Clarice. I sat across from her, the glass partition between us reflecting my cold, determined face. I showed her a still image on my phone of her and Thorn discussing Martha. Her face went from defiant to absolutely paralyzed. "I'm not going to send you to jail just for what you did to Klein," I told her, my voice a whisper that felt like a blade. "I am going to make sure you never see the sun again for what you did to Martha and whoever else is on those tapes. Unless we make a deal." I laid out the terms. She would gift me her entire share of the main family estate, a property worth $1.2 million, immediately. In exchange, I would hand over the Martha footage to her lawyer instead of the federal prosecutor, giving her a slim chance at a plea deal. She had no choice. She signed the transfer papers right there in the visitor's room, her hand shaking. I walked out of that jail and straight to a lawyer's office. I filed for divorce from Klein, Maine, while he was still hooked up to his heart monitor in the recovery wing. I used the $1.2 million estate I had just squeezed out of Clarice to pay off every single cent of the gambling debt Klein had racked up. I didn't do it out of love. I did it to clear my own name and protect my credit score. I didn't leave Klein with nothing. I left him with exactly what he had earned: his life, and a very long, very detailed bill for his own recovery and legal fees. I didn't give him a penny of the remaining money. I was cleaning the landscape, removing the dead weight and the rot that had been poisoning my life. I was taking back the soil. Thorne lost his medical license and is facing 30 years, and Clarice is currently waiting for a trial that will likely keep her behind bars for the rest of her life. I am sitting on the deck of my new home now, overlooking a sprawling garden I designed myself. The air is clear and smells of jasmine and fresh rain. There is no wood-fired pizza on the counter, no whispers in the dark, and no heavy silence that screams of danger. My name is Julianne. I am 34 years old, and I am the master of my own landscape. Clarice is in a state facility, Thorne is in a cage, and Klein is living in a tiny studio apartment, working a 9-to-5 job to pay me back for the forged signatures he left on my life. I used to fear coming home to an empty house because I thought it meant I was alone. Now I realize that an empty house is just a blank canvas, a place where no one can hurt me and no one can lie to me. The revenge wasn't loud or violent, it was surgical and permanent. I took a life that was meant to be over and turned it into a masterpiece of my own making. I am finally home. If you love ProRevenge, nuclear revenge, or true crime-style storytelling, Thriller will keep you glued to your screen until the very last second. Julianne didn't just get mad, she got surgical. Will Julianne save her husband, or will the final secret destroy her entire future? Watch until the end for the most satisfying emotional payoff of 2026. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more viral revenge and drama. Hit the bell so you never miss a twist. Comment below, what would you do if you found a secret IV bag in your house?